So, with all of that in mind, moving towards how we function in the world, the material creation was made by God to be developed, cultivated, and cared for in an endless number of ways through human labor. But even the simplest of these ways is important. Without them all, human life cannot flourish. Next slide. One of my favorite quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. is this one. He was talking to a group of African Americans in a time of racism and when they had less opportunities in the workplace. And he says this to them: if a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep the streets even as Michelangelo painted, or Beethoven composed music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep the streets so well that all the hosts of heaven will pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. And if you don't think that matters, how many of us could complain about customer service? Right? We'll talk about how jobs are less valuable or worth less, or we don't like the pay, or that's not good. But how often do we just talk about how much we hate bad customer service? How many times have you run into someone who does that job well and you're thankful for it? That's the call on our lives. It doesn't matter. There's no difference in the kingdom of God. God desires obedience more than sacrifice. So if he calls you to be a janitor or a CEO, that is unimportant according to the world's standards. We're just being obedient to what God has called us to do and then doing that job to the best of our ability. And Martin Luther King nails it. Next slide. Mark 6. And when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many listeners were astonished, saying, where did this man learn these things? And what is the wisdom that has been given to him? And such miracles as these he performed by his hands. Is this not the carpenter? We know that Jesus grew up in a home where his parents followed the ways of God. You can go to Luke chapter 2 and read all about how his childhood is growing up in a home where his parents are doing the things that God has asked them to do and placing him in positions to learn. But he's also growing up a carpenter's son. And Jesus doesn't start his ministry until he is 30, which means his preparation for his ministry of 3 years was being a carpenter for 30. So whatever season you're in, whatever job you're doing, whatever the work of your hands is always preparation for the next thing. It might not be a season of ministry like it was for Jesus, but it might be taking your degree to a job and from that job to another job. Does that make sense? So the Lord is using whatever season we are in to prepare us for what he is calling us to. The type of job doesn't matter. Jesus wouldn't have been who he was if he wasn't a carpenter also. So he is a carpenter and the Christ. Next slide. See, I have chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Hur, in the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God. This is the first person in the Bible filled with the Spirit. And what is he filled with the Spirit to do and for? With wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, with all kinds of skills. To do what? To make artistic designs for work. We like to talk about spiritual gifts and the fruit of the Spirit, but I don't think we often talk about how the first person in the Bible is filled with the Spirit to do their job well. And that he knows more about being an electrician or a plumber or a mom or a CEO than we do. Do we actually think that God knows everything? And that he can actually help us do our job better? That he can actually implant wisdom and understanding and knowledge and skills that we do not have by the power of his Spirit? Guys, that's just as amazing as any spiritual gift. That he has called you and equipped you with the Spirit of God to do your job well. Next slide. 2 chapters later, Moses said this. Moses said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go? And check this out. What else will distinguish me and your people from all other people of the face of the earth? His presence. What makes us different? What marks us as different? The Spirit of God on us, in our lives, acting in the world. He has gifted us and equipped us and called us to specific things. And when we do them through the power of the Spirit, we have greater wisdom, greater knowledge, greater understanding, greater skill. Our quiet time and our workplace are the same job, friends. We don't separate those. Our whole life is with God. We don't have separate departments. They function together. If we separate them in our lives, we will feel incongruent and inconsistent, and it will make it way harder than it's supposed to be. God wants to do life with us. not separate portions for separate things. Next verse, or next passage. Genesis 38. And the Lord was with Joseph. So what? So he became a successful man. That whole passage is just everything that Joseph did prosper. Joseph is a slave. What does the last thing say? So he, Joseph's master, left Joseph, who is a slave, in charge of everything that he owned. With him there he did not concern himself with anything except for food which he ate. Can the CEO of our company or the boss or our overseer or our manager feel confident to leave everything in our charge and be comfortable with it? Are we working in such a way to the glory of God that our coworkers trust us, that our bosses trust us when they're away? Joseph is a slave. You don't get lower than slave. And he worked faithfully in that place so that when God elevated him to the highest position in Egypt, below Pharaoh, and he had control over everything, he was the same man he was when he was a slave. Does that make sense? You don't get raised to that position and not have had the character beforehand and do well at the job. He did well as a slave, so he did well as a king. Next slide. But Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, for you are only a youth, while he has been a warrior since his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant was tending his father's sheep." What is that? That's his day job. He's a shepherd. He's doing what God has called him to do. He is being faithful as a shepherd. And so what is part of being a faithful shepherd? When a lion or a bear came and took a sheep from the flock, I went out after it and attacked it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it rose up against me, I grabbed it by its mane and struck it and killed it. Maybe a little bit more violent of a day job than most of us. But the point is, he had done his job well. And he knew that God was with him when he fought a lion and a bear. So if God is with him then, and he has a track record of the faithfulness of God through doing the difficult things in his day job, why would he not trust God to help him overcome Goliath? He did the hard things where God had called him, and he had been faithful with his job. And so when he faced lions and bears, he looked out and saw Goliath and was like, another one. Let him fall, because God is faithful. Next slide. This is Ruth and Boaz. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" And Boaz replied to her, "All that you have" what? "Done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work." All that she had done, God's going to reward her work. Next slide. 1 Thessalonians 4:11 through 12. And make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that this is so good. Your daily life may win the respect of outsiders. Are we living our daily lives in such a way that we win the respect of outsiders? With how we do our jobs, with how we love our families? Do our neighbors recognize those things? Do our coworkers recognize those things? The only person that you should ever compare yourself to is the you of yesterday in light of who Christ is. No one has the same family as you, the same friends as you, the same job as you, the same opportunities as you, the same difficulties as you. No one. There's only one you, uniquely designed by God, which means the only person you can compare yourself to is you. And our marker is who I am today compared to yesterday in light of who Christ wants me to be. Are we hitting that mark? Are we aiming for that goal? Because side-to-side comparison in the kingdom is death, friends. That's not the way it works. The only thing we compare ourselves to is who we were yesterday and who we are today in light of wanting to become more like Christ in every aspect of our life. I felt called to be a pastor at a young age. It's a generational thing within my family. My dad's a pastor, my granddad's a pastor, my great-granddads are pastors. It might go further than that, I don't know. There are others of you in this room who maybe are generational doctors or generational accountants or generational whatever it may be. But I knew that in order to do the job that God had called me to, regardless of the jobs I was doing, I needed to do it well and to the best of my ability, like David did, to prepare for a future season. One of my first jobs was being a leather craftsman. And I did that for about 6 years for a company called Go Forth Goods. Some of you are probably holding bags that I made. I worked there for about 6 years, and when I started working at the company, we made like $40,000 that first year. I was the first full-time employee. And by the time I left 6 years later, we were making over $1 million a year as a company. I have made thousands and thousands of tote bags and thousands of briefcases and thousands of wallets. And I can handcraft a $1,000 briefcase in 18 hours with an X-Acto blade, a couple copper rivets, and thread. And I know that dependent upon the depth at which I hammer with the hole punch, that I'm either going to be stitching 113 to 118 stitches along the side of that. And I know that as I'm hand stitching that with cross thread, that I have to pull with the exact same strength all the way down the entire process. Because if I pull with a different strength, by the time I finish handcrafting that product, the briefcase would be slanted. And so I have to intentionally pay attention to detail and craft very disciplined, pulling the exact same strength all the way down the entire briefcase. And I can lay down a leather piece of scrap on a thing, and within 1/8 of an inch, I can cut 32 inches every single time, because that was the size of every strap I made, and I made thousands and thousands of straps. Did I want to do that job? No. But is that what God called me to do in that season, to prepare me for a future one? Yes. And I did that to the best of my ability, and I did it well. And I think that the company thrived and flourished because of it. And I also recognized that as I was doing the work with my hands, that my mind was free. And so I listened to hundreds and hundreds of sermons and hundreds of books and hundreds of, I went through the Bible, 66 books in 66 days. I utilized the season I was in to prepare me for a future season, even when it wasn't where I wanted to be. And then the Lord elevated me to a position that I didn't think I was gonna get at the age that I currently am at, because I was faithful in a previous season. And I don't have to worry about not being prepared for what God had called me to, because I know that I was diligent in the season that I didn't want to be in, to be prepared for a future one. That's what we're all supposed to do. We should be the best workers in the room, if not in specific skill and talent, in our work ethic, because we're working unto the glory of God and not to man.